Joe Coburn with a new week of Politics Live.
Teachers in England are back on strike. Which is the party of home ownership? And should we be scared of artificial intelligence? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Bim Afellamy, Chair of the Commons Business and Trade Committee, Labour's Darren Jones, columnist for the I newspaper and former Labour advisor Andrew Fisher, and Reem Ibrahim from the free market think tank, the IEA. Today...
What do we want? School funding! When do we want it? Now!
Teachers in England are back on strike, and with more unions rejecting this year's pay offer, could disruption in schools get worse?
It's childcare that's an issue, but I support the teachers, the fact that, but I think the kids are getting a hit on the head.
What we are not prepared to accept, and none of the teacher unions have accepted, the offer that the government has made.
Hi, I've just had a message off you telling me to hang up that I've been scammed. I feel like such a...
Fraud is now the #1 crime in the UK, but is enough being done to tackle it? We'll be joined by BBC reporter Nick Stapleton, who's trying to stop the scammers. And help for first-time buyers is back on the political agenda, but which party has the best plan to get people on the housing ladder? Let's start with this story. BBC News headline: AI godfather Geoffrey Hinton warns of danger as he quits Google. Dangers of AI. His pioneering research paved the way for the current artificial intelligence systems like ChatGPT. He now says, though, that he regrets some of his work over fears of how it could develop and be used by bad actors. So let's start the programme with you, Darren, because you've written to the government about this very issue. Does that mean you're scared about AI and what it could do?
No, I'm very supportive of AI and technology insofar as it can improve productivity in the private sector, improve pay and profits, and help us deliver the public services we want in a better way and a cheaper way. But we're never going to get to that if there's a kind of high-risk outcome that scares the public or Parliament, and then we respond by trying to close these things down. So what I've said to the government is that Britain should be leading an intergovernmental, a kind of global debate about how we safely and securely test the most advanced types of AI within a safe setting so that we can avoid the risk of one of these high-risk outcomes, restricting our application of technology in perfectly normal cases elsewhere in the economy.
Bib?
I think what Darren said is very sensible. I would go further and say that we've got to take it seriously if people like Professor Hinton, like Elon Musk, if people who know a lot about this are worried, we do have to take that seriously. I think that the advantage we have in terms of as a world thinking about AI is that the number of companies or groups that have the amount of money required to build something that could really have any sort of significant impact is actually quite small. So we can actually deal with a relatively small number of actors and talk to them and work out how we're going to progress going forward, because there's no solution that Britain can just do alone or the European Union.
So what's the government doing about it?
Well, the truth is that everybody, including people in technology, are trying to catch up with this because it's developing at such a rate that it's very, very hard to think about it from a legal or political perspective very quickly. What we need, I think Darren is right, I think what the government needs to do now is to start more conversations with other countries, particularly the United States, particularly the big tech giants, to make sure that we are all broadly on the same page.
Well, I mean, there is this government task force that has been set up, but even the chair of that task force, Matt Clifford, has some reservations when he says we are building the most powerful technology in the history of our species.
And if that doesn't excite you a little bit and terrify you a little bit, then there's probably something wrong with you. Now, the real challenge is that we are advancing the capabilities of these systems faster than we're advancing our ability to control them.
Now, that is a big risk. That was Matt Clifford, by the way, speaking on Sunday with Laura Kuenssberg. And I'm just going to come back to you briefly, Dan. When you talk about high-risk outcome, what are these? We keep talking about how terrifying it is, what might happen. What are we talking about?
Let's take an example. You can get an AI system that could automatically create a novel cyber weapon that we've not seen before. That's a national security risk that we should have proper oversight of. But the UK is out of kilter with other countries. On the one hand, we're world leading in our companies and academics because it's us, it's the Americans, the Canadians and the Chinese that really lead in this space. But the government in the UK has said it wants to take an innovation-led approach, which basically means no new regulation, and we've got to fill that gap.
Well, no new regulation. I mean, a task force has been set up to deal with it. Are you terrified or excited by it?
Probably a little bit of both, but moderately on both ends. I mean, I think technology has always been has had this dichotomy to it of the risks of it and the advantages of it, and it's about government regulation. It's about us using it in the public interest, and that applies to whether it's nuclear technology or digital technology like this. But if you look at some forms of AI, like facial recognition software, where the police and there have been trials of CCTV. There are serious problems with that in the criminal justice system because it's less good with certain ethnicities, it seems, at being able to identify people, which obviously has huge risks if you then apply that to a criminal justice system. Likewise, I think the DWP did voice risk analysis software to try and catch benefit fraudsters and then abandoned it because the technology wasn't there. But again, if you get these things wrong and you're reliant on technology that people think is immaculate and can't be wrong, then there are risks with that. So it's about having regulation, having trials, sensibly piloting these things so that you don't have these adverse outcomes that are potentially there.
Should we be embracing it more so that the UK is at the forefront of encouraging investment in AI here?
Oh, absolutely. I think that we should be more excited about these possibilities than cautious of them. I think that when we're potentially looking at the policies that a government could be implementing in order to regulate AI, I actually think we should look at this from a permissionless perspective. So as these issues arise, then we sort of face them and look at them from that perspective. But I actually think that in the long term, we should really be looking at how exciting these opportunities could be and how good they could be for the welfare of society. I mean, we're looking at potentially the healthcare outcomes that ChatGPT could be used in order to be very specific about what those patients need. And it essentially means that a lot of that pressure could be taken away from government officials.
Darren?
I mean, look, if you take the nuclear example, in a permissionless society, you might create a nuclear power station that everyone's grateful for, or a nuclear weapon that people are definitely not grateful for. In advanced of artificial intelligence, you are potentially in a similar space, and the UK has real global advantage on this and could really start to lead the international debate if it wants to.
What sort of regulation would you like the government to introduce?
At the moment, none, because I think that the broad approach is correct, because, as I said, this only works when you're dealing internationally because of the completely borderless nature of it.
I mean, the EU has put forward a legislative framework.
And they don't have many leading AI companies, because the truth is, if right now Britain were to do what Italy's done and ban ChatGPT-4, for example, then guess what? A lot of people will not develop their AI-enabled technology in this country, and that will mean we actually, in the future, have less control about what happens rather than more. So what we've got to do is, again, think internationally. I think the leading into bilateral discussions or multilateral discussions about how we actually regulate this, again, including the major tech players. There are not that many of them. We know where they are. And to talk to them and say, look, you are the people with the power here in terms of being able to create these new artificial intelligence, whatever the risks or the successes might be. We also have the legal power. Let's come together and get a right outcome that benefits everybody.
Happy with that?
Partly, but also partly not, because...
I was so nice to you.
Yeah, well,
it wasn't worthwhile.
I should stop.
Bim and I get on. But where we do disagree is that the UK government could and should be doing more. You rightly identify legal action in the European Union. Even the Americans are bringing forward regulation in this space, and they don't normally get that far. We're going to have to do the same in the UK. But at the moment, we've got this dichotomy where the government has rightly recognised the problem and set up a task force. That's good and welcome, but it refuses to lead on the discussion around regulation, and that seems to be nonsensical.
Let's talk about strikes, because today teachers are walking out of classrooms across the country for the 5th time this year over pay and recruitment and retention. Previous strikes by members of the National Education Union have affected more than half the schools in England. The union says GCSE and A-level students, because exams are about to start, will still be able to study, and vulnerable children will also be protected. But this is the headline in the Daily Telegraph. Teachers' strikes could disrupt GCSE and A-level students as thousands of teachers walk out. Are the strikes justified, Bim?
No, but I think it's important to say that I understand how some teachers feel that they need more pay, and that's...
It's not just some.
Well, no, OK, but I understand the reasons. I don't think it's justified, because I think the impacts on those young people who've been through so much after COVID is just it's terrible. And what I would like to see, obviously the government's got a huge part to play in this. They need to come together with the teachers' unions and the education sector more generally. What I'd like to see is a multi-year settlement over a longer period of time than politicians typically think. You know, I'm talking maybe 4, 5, 6 years, to show that, yes, we do understand that they need more pay, and the government's obviously done what it can over the deal that's proposed, I think, for the next 2 years. But we need to think over the next 5, 6 years, OK, how do we get there? And the trade-off for that is that we don't have strikes and we get better education for our kids who are just suffering through, I mean, 5th time you said this year. I mean, that's an appalling outcome for kids that have been through COVID and all the difficulties with that.
Do you agree?
Again, partly. I mean, look, the long-term economic growth potential for the country rests on our young people being educated and fit to make the most when they're older.
Right, so the strikes aren't justified.
No, so the strikes are therefore justified because actually for the past 13 years, there's been a structural decline in public sector financing of our schools and our teachers, which results in this absurd position now where people don't want to become teachers because they don't feel like they can afford to pay the bills as well as teach our future generations. This is a sticking plaster problem. We need a long-term approach to settling teacher pay, investing in our schools, investing in our state education, because it will pay back in the long run.
Right, and are you looking at what sort of percentage pay rise? I mean, you're right, teachers' pay on average has gone down. It's been cut in real terms. In other words, prices have gone up faster than their wages. It's about 10% since 2010. Is that the sort of pay offer you would like to see?
Look, it's not for me to just make up numbers out of thin air. I'm not in the room doing the negotiations, but we definitely need to get a deal, and teachers do need to see their pay increase, not just now or next year, but in line for the long run, so there's sustained funding from an economy that is growing and not declining as it has been over the last 13 years.
Well, and the problem is there are no negotiations.
Well, we had negotiation. We came to a deal. We came to
what we came to a deal.
The government proposed after a long period of negotiating, and then so we are sort of stuck at the moment. But I hope that negotiations will continue.
And how would you do that? How would you unlock that?
Well, I mean, it depends highly. It depends highly on the individuals and the personalities and how that relationship can develop. But I just wanted to take up something that Darren was saying, or rather that you said in question to Darren. 10%, you said, roughly, the fall in real terms pay. We've had inflation, largely due to global factors, of about 10%. A big part of the problem...
Yeah, but this is since 2010. I'm not talking about just in recent times.
I agree, but hold on. But if you get 10% at the end, that has had a huge impact on pay. And so the real reason why we're having these problems in the public sector is over the last year, we've had a huge spike of inflation. That has been the biggest driving force. That's one of the reasons why getting inflation down as quickly as possible is, I think, one of the most important things,
Darren,
the most important thing the government can do.
You know this bit. Teachers' relative pay compared to other parts of the economy has been declining for years. Yes, there's been a high inflationary environment, partly due to kind of global issues, but this is a long-term issue that's now exploded into these strikes, and that's why you need a long-term answer.
Would you like teachers to get back into the classroom?
I would, and I have a huge amount of sympathy for these teachers that are, of course, across the public sector. We're seeing many public sector workers receive a real terms pay cut. We all are, unfortunately, as a result of inflation. I do want to challenge this argument that inflation is a result of sort of global factors and has nothing to do with the government's own actions themselves with regard to quantitative easing and buying up government debt in the Bank of England. A lot of this inflation is a result of the government's own fault themselves. In terms of teachers' pay, really what we're talking about within this conversation is how much do teachers deserve to be paid, and how much do they actually...
How much do you think they do?
Well, I think that should be left up to the market, and unfortunately, at the moment, the state is deciding what teachers are worth, rather than allowing employers to compete in order to actually decide what you think teachers' pay should be.
Do you agree with that, Andrew?
Well, there is a market, and teachers are voting with their feet, unfortunately, and they're not applying to become teachers, and they're leaving the profession in record numbers, which is why last year the government only hit 59% of its teacher recruitment target. We were talking about AI just now. Their target on computing teachers, they only met 35% of it. I've got a friend who's got a child in secondary school just doing their GCSE options. He's been told he can't do computing because the school doesn't have the teachers, the qualified teachers, to offer that subject. Now, that's ridiculous. We're, 5th, 6th biggest country in the, economically in the world, and this is the cutting edge of technology, and children can't do computing at GCSE in some schools because they haven't got the teachers. So it's a complete failure. We clearly need to raise wages. There's a recruitment crisis, same as there is with nurses. This is just blatantly obvious. If you want more people in classrooms, you've got 500,000 children being taught in class sizes of over 30 because of the lack of teachers, another 500,000 being taught by unqualified teachers with teaching assistants filling the gap where teachers should be. That's a real problem. And unless you want, as Darren said, if you want a productive economy in the future, you need to invest in children now in schools.
I totally agree, but I think that in order for us to attract the best and the brightest in this country, I mean, why do a lot of these incredibly educated people go and work in the private sector rather than go into teaching?
Because they can get paid more.
Because they can be paid more,
exactly. And the pay's been driven down over the last 13 years.
Absolutely, which is why if we allow competition, allow us to marketise the education system, actually, not only will that allow more choice for parents and for families and for teachers, but actually what that will allow is teachers to be paid even more.
Just in areas where you have got a very free market, not many unions involved in that, is pay higher or lower, do you think? I mean, if you take, say, the social care sector, for instance, which is not very well unionised, you've got pay rates of, £10, £11 an hour. That's, free market. Not very
Absolutely, didn't say it shouldn't be unionised at all.
Yeah.
I mean, just looking at, for example, Sweden, which has no minimum wage but has huge amounts of union power, and unions are able to freely negotiate with employers because government stays out of it.
We need stronger trade union rights. Excellent.
Right, what do you mean by rights, though?
Well, the right to collectively bargain with employers and across industries, sectoral.
I absolutely believe in the right to withdraw one's labour, but I equally believe that freedom goes both ways, and employers have the right to negotiate that and also terminate the employment of those that are striking if they see.
Well, I mean, let's see what... I mean, given there's a teacher recruitment crisis, I'm not sure sacking loads of teachers is going to help with the teacher recruitment crisis. Maybe we could do that with the nurses as well and have even bigger backlogs in the NHS. 7.2 million, maybe we could get that up to 10.
Right.
I mean, nice round figure.
You were smiling during that discussion there, Darren. Why?
Well, I suppose it was fun in many ways, but the reality of it is that our schools are not a market, nor is our health service. They are public services. And what that means is that the government has a responsibility to create the conditions for strong economic growth, to bring in taxes, to pay for the public services that meet the needs of the country.
Right, because what sort of pay rise would you be asking Labour to offer?
Look, I think the teachers have asked for it to increase in line with inflation, which is 10% this year, as been said. I think that's a reasonable demand. When inflation's 2 or 3%, people get inflation-proof pay rises. It's not an abnormal thing. Obviously, the government needs to be doing more to bring down inflation, and it could be doing more. We have the highest inflation in the G7 and in Western Europe at the moment. So there is more that can be done on that side of it, but we also need to match people's wages to it. And this is about
But if it comes down, the Office for Budget Responsibility is predicting, rightly or wrongly, that inflation could come down to 2.9%, and then those pay rises will be much higher.
Last year and this current year, where inflation has been at that level. So you need to address that.
Are they affordable? Is that the only way to resolve this?
Well, I think the problem with what Andrew was saying was that if you have pay rises of, say, 10% in one area of the public sector, you will very, very quickly be facing demands for 10% across all the public sector that employs, and the public sector occupies, about 40% or so of the GDP of the country. Very, very quickly, you're embedding higher inflation over a longer period of time. And then you get into a spiral. And that spiral we saw in the 70s, and not just in this country, by the way, but in other countries as well. And it took many, many years of government struggling, a very long time to try and get a handle on it. What I think a better approach is, of course, yes, you're right, we need to bring inflation down, and that's a huge focus for the government, and should be. But also, as I was saying, a longer-term view, and I think Darren agrees with this, a longer-term view of getting teachers' pay up. I think that it's recognised that teachers' pay needs to be increased, but doing that over a long period of time so that we don't bed in high levels of inflation now.
Right, that is the risk, of course, is that inflation does not come down. It's difficult to judge how inflationary pay rises are if you were to put them up across the board, but it is an important point.
Well, it's different in the public sector because you don't have that knock-on effect on the market. So if you put up people's wages, say, in supermarkets,
of course
you do have that knock-on effect.
Of course you have a knock-on effect on the market because someone doesn't just stay working in the public sector or the private sector. They can go in between both.
Look, you don't. But look, if you want, do you want to solve the teacher recruitment crisis? That's the question. And if you do, then you've got to pay. You can't drive teachers' wages. If you listen to the IFS, they say teachers' pay is £6,600 lower in real terms than it was in 2010. That's why people aren't applying to be teachers.
Where is this money coming from that we're going to if we're going to give teachers inflation-busting pay rises?
Well, if we could afford it in 2010, why can't we afford it now? I mean, we're one of the richest countries in the world.
More amounts of government spending now than we had 10 years ago.
Well, yes, but that's because we have a larger population and various demands.
To pay for
there are a whole range of areas of government spending I would personally cut. But look, I think you can afford this. And by the way, any teacher's pay rise, over a third of it automatically comes back to government in tax and NI anyway. And then you've got council tax, VAT when people shop. So this helps stimulate the economy. At the moment, we've got an economy where people's wages are going down, more is being spent on rent and housing, and therefore you've got less going into the economy.
And we're going to talk about housing, but on the recruitment, teacher recruitment is 41% below target for secondary schools this year. I mean, that is a serious lack and shortage of teachers. Do you agree a pay rise, a bigger pay rise, would help resolve that?
It would depend exactly how big it was. I actually think when you actually look at the data for why teachers are leaving, when they leave, pay doesn't necessarily come at number one. So it's important that we don't think pay is this sort of silver bullet that solves everything with the teacher recruitment issue. Of course, there are issues with just broad what they perceive to be how attractive the profession is, and you see that in different areas of the public sector and private sector. It's also worth saying that we have a very tight labour market, which means that it's not just teachers or parts of the NHS where we have difficulty recruiting. There are difficulty recruiting across different areas of the private sector as well as the public sector. It's a broader societal problem at the moment that appear to be a lot of shortages of skilled labour in many areas.
Right, but do you agree a bigger pay rise would help solve that recruitment problem?
Partly helps, but what BIM is also referring to is the need for reform of our public services. And what he's therefore impliedly acknowledging is that after 13 years of this government messing around with our public services, we've been landed with a mess. Teachers, nurses, doctors are not just striking about pay, they're striking about working conditions, investment in the capabilities and capacity they have, the work that they're being asked to do. And we need to be able to increase their pay, yes, but we need an economy that's growing to do that, and we need to take reform of our public services deeply seriously because we can't afford them in the current state.
I'll let BIM respond.
Well, I agree that we need to focus again after dealing with, obviously we left the European Union, Brexit and COVID. Yes, we need to take seriously reforming public services.
There were problems
I suspect that my prescription for reform may be different to yours, but I think that I very strongly welcome that a Labour politician is now saying we should reform the public services in ways that we can actually improve
We seem to
outcomes.
forget of 6 years of austerity from the Conservatives where they cut public sector funding to the bone, including on capital investment.
I seem to remember even Labour at that time were certainly forecasting that they would do something similar in response in terms of cutting capital spending and making the same sort of cuts to departments.
Maybe that was the case. I wasn't around then, but I can tell you now that
Although
Labour's
the
not
government have already
last
year given teachers a 5% pay rise and then offered extra £2.3 billion in spending. I mean, we can continue to say we just want to throw more taxpayer money at these institutions.
5% when inflation was 10%.
Yeah,
should point out.
Absolutely, but we're talking about the working conditions. That extra £2.3 billion surely should have solved that. But of course, every time we argue that we're going to spend more money on an institution that's already broken, we can keep throwing taxpayer money at it. But unless we have serious institutional reform within our education system, unfortunately, working standards won't rise.
We're going to leave it there because I want you to take a look at this.
As I can see on my system that you're looking for a loan amount of £1,000 for 2 years with a monthly installment £70 a month, right?
Okay, I'm calling her now.
Okay, no problem.
As we're trying to intercept, the first scammer has handed the call over to a more experienced colleague.
So give me 1 minute only. I'm doing some legal formalities. I'm making a file over here.
He'll be a closer, the person who takes the payment for the fake loan.
So the scammer's now taking her through the final stages of this.
Just give me 1 minute.
She's not answered. So if we can't get through to this woman, she's going to pay out right now. She sounds suspicious. Please tell me she's seen something from us.
I've just got a text message saying scam warning, hang up your phone and ring your bank.
Oh, listen, she got a text.
Where you got this message, ma'am?
Listen.
I got a text message.
Ma'am, I'll tell you, maybe you are getting a message from any other loan company.
I have no idea where it's from, but it's
no, I'm asking you for the insurance money, which I'm going to activate in your profile, so I can process the money in your bank account.
It's hard to hear the audio, but she just said that she got a text message that says scam warning, hang up and call your bank immediately.
That was a clip from the Scam Interceptors. The return of that programme on BBC One came yesterday and on the iPlayer. In the programme, a team of ethical hackers intercept cyber criminals in the act, as you saw there, helping to prevent vulnerable people falling victim. Scams account currently for around 40% of all crime. Let's talk to Nick Stapleton. You saw him there in the clip. He's the member of the Scam Interceptors team. Just tell us a bit more about how widespread this is.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So I think when most people think about scams, they imagine that what we're talking about is some people in hoodies sitting in front of laptops, when the reality of the situation is that this problem is now so bad. I think Ofcom put out figures last year that said that 45 million of us had had a scam call or a text. And what we've been able to document as part of the programme that we make is that this is being conducted by enormous businesses. You're talking about corporations who have hundreds of employees who are capable of making sometimes as many as 100,000 or even nearly 1 million calls a day to UK numbers. That's a day. And they are conducting this every single day, 6 days a week, 365 days a year sometimes. It is very, very scary stuff. And the amount of money that they are making is extraordinary.
I mean, the scale is absolutely massive. I mean, where are most of the fraudsters in this business based?
So the FBI did some research last year and they found that 85% of the scam calls that were going to the US were coming from India. And I would say that what we found in the programme does reflect that. The vast majority of scam call centres, of mega scam call centres, the really big ones that we see doing a lot of these calls, do appear to be based in India. There are plenty of others around the world, but the ethical hacker that we work with, Jim, he has documented at least, certainly in the hundreds of scam call centres based in India.
Right, Nick, stay with us for the discussion. Bim, the government's expected to announce a new national fraud strategy this week. What would you like to see them do to protect consumers?
There are a couple of things. One is, without talking about recruitment all over again, making sure we've got the right skills in different institutions and in central government to help on this, whether it be HMRC and other places, and indeed the police, because we've gone from a world where most crime is in person to a world where most crime's online, and that's a big, big shift that has happened over the last, say, 10, 15 years. So that's one thing, people. Secondly, it's just focus, because there's so much going on. There are always so many different things to try and tackle and to deal with. A lot of our, if you think about financial services, obviously a lot of this is to do with banks and how people get access to their money. We spend a lot of time regulating all sorts of different things in financial services. Let's have as much focus as we can on fraud. For example, when you make a payment on your online bank and it goes within an hour or half an hour, it is possible to delay that for a period of time so that we can double check that it's not fraudulent. That sort of thing might be the sort of regulation that we might put in.
I mean, do you think it'll make a dent into the sort of thing we've just heard from Nick, Darren?
Partly. I mean, there's a whole host of issues here. I mean, one of them is the telephone numbers. So Labour said that we need to put in regulation to stop international organisations being able to have a mask of a UK number that then comes through to people in the UK. That's one small measure that will make quite a big difference in blocking a lot of these calls coming internationally. But Bim is right. You also need the specialists in the police force, and you need the police to be resourced to be able to take these things seriously. I had a constituent that lost £40,000 because of a scam telephone call, and I worked with her to talk to the bank, to talk to the fraud action group, to talk to the police force. It didn't go anywhere, and she lost all of her money, and there was nothing for her as a victim to get compensation. That can't be right.
I mean, the UK government is apparently, according to the Financial Times, a report saying watering down fraud proposals for tech groups, in other words, for compensation for people like Darren's constituent. Should they stick to their guns on this and actually force payouts for compensation?
I have to see it. I haven't seen that. But broadly, the issue is let's worry about raising money for compensation. Let's try and prevent it from happening as much in the first place. So that's how I think we should have our focus.
Have you been victim of a scam?
I haven't personally, but I mean, like everyone who's got a mobile phone or an email account, you get thousands of these kind of false messages, all the time, don't you? That mostly get filtered into your spam box or junk mail. Or whatever, but you do get them, and of course it's dangerous. And I consider myself relatively savvy online, and touch wood, haven't got caught by one yet. But I think there's a number of issues. One is the resourcing probably of the National Crime Agency, because this is big scale kind of fraud, as well as international agreements. I mean, if a lot of this is coming with India, we need to be working bilaterally with India, because I can't believe that this is legal to do in India, even if there are hundreds of employees in some of these companies doing it. So we need we need their assistance to crack down on it as well, if that's where it's coming from. Although obviously there are other countries involved as well. I don't want to pick on India necessarily, but if that's where the bulk of it's coming from, that needs to happen.
Well, it sounds like it, doesn't it?
Yeah. So I think we do need to do that. I think there's also a role for the technology companies in educating people about how to use, I mean, obviously it's different with phone calls, but with emails and with online bank accounts and so on, of what banks do send to you and what they don't, and for the banks to do that as well. because a lot of this is people pretending to be your bank as well.
Difficult for the police with the resources that they have to deal with this.
It is, and I also think that I think the police have actually been sort of failed quite miserably on this issue. I mean, we saw with the introduction of technology and with technological advancements, a lot of these new crimes that came about, the government actually spent more money on trying to take up this. Now we're seeing a lot of these new crimes, especially also with the developments in AI, where a lot of these fraudsters are able to use artificial intelligence or able to use family members' voices in order to do this. So even if we are, younger and tech savvy, actually a lot of these crimes can go unnoticed. I think what worries me about this is that a lot of the victims tend to be the most vulnerable, those that are older, those that are less technologically advanced, those that are slightly less able to use their phones in that way. So I think it is really about education.
Right, Nick, do you agree with that?
I agree with some of it. I would say that I don't think it's just supposedly vulnerable members of our population who are being targeted by this. I think scammers are very unscrupulous and they will target everybody. The right scam on the wrong day can catch any of us, so I don't think you're too clever to get caught by this. But the last thing I would say is that, to me, technology has put us in this position. It's created a situation where a single business can be making hundreds of thousands or even 1 million calls a day to the UK. Technology has to be the thing that gets us out. I don't think you can expect law enforcement to actually be able to solve this problem.
Right, and you've obviously come to that conclusion having made this programme. What about things people can do to protect themselves?
So I think my absolute best piece of advice is that this issue is now so serious that you should view any call or text that comes completely out of the blue as being a scam until proven otherwise. And also, top tip, if you do get a scam call and you're pretty sure it's a scam, it's a very good idea to tell the person on the phone that you know it's a scam. Because these businesses, they operate like real call centres. They classify each call they make. And if you say you know it's a scam, they'll put you down as a do not call. And what that means is when they come to sell their data onto the next call centre, you won't be on that list.
Right, when we were talking a little bit earlier, we were saying that actually people are often too polite, aren't they, in the UK when they do receive their calls, probably on a landline.
I do think to some extent that there is a cultural problem here in that in Britain we're naturally inclined to give someone the benefit of the doubt and perhaps to stay on the phone longer than we should. When we've monitored calls to the US, for example, believe me, they are much more quick to say go away and hang up than we are.
Well, that was a very polite way of ending our conversation too. Nick Stapleton, thank you very much. Let's talk about housing because it's clearly hotting up as a political issue. Going to the top of the agenda over the weekend, both Labour and the Conservatives turned their attention to first-time buyers. Keir Starmer gave an interview to The Observer. I think we can show you the headline there. I want Labour to be the party of home ownership. Well, wanting it, of course, and actually achieving it are two very different things. One of the things Labour has said is that they are going to restore mandatory housing targets. This follows, of course, the government dropping that whole idea. Was it a mistake, Bim?
No. I think that it's a good principle to say that in a local area, the local people ultimately should help shape how the housing is
except they just don't get built, do they?
No, not always. But what I would say is that the Conservative Party has always been the party of home ownership. That's why Keir is saying, I want Labour to be. He's acknowledging that Labour isn't. But we need to do a lot more because, I'm doing some work at the moment looking at attitudes amongst people in their sort of millennials, late 20s, 30s and until early 40s. And home ownership is an absolutely critical issue.
Yeah.
I'd like to see us look at things like it's not just the supply of homes, it's also just about the amount of money you have in order to get on the housing ladder. So it's around how mortgages are done, the regulations around that, how much money people have, how can we increase the Help to Buy ISA significantly so that people can get on the housing ladder.
It's
I
not
think
just,
all of those things we need to look at.
It's not just about supply. Do you admit that Labour hasn't been the party then of home ownership, hence the big interview and the big headline at the weekend?
Well, we've not been in government for a long time.
That's true.
I would rather that, of course. Building houses is one part of the solution. Another part of the solution, which I think is really interesting in the announcements that Keir has made in the last few days, is about how you help first-time buyers get a mortgage. Because, of course, the percentage deposit that you need, especially in cities like mine in Bristol, here in London, where the value of houses is very high, for the majority of young people, unless their parents give it to them or they marry into wealth, is just insurmountable. So we've been looking at international good practice where you can put in government-backed insurance schemes, where you can test people's income, their ability to pay the mortgage, and to help them get over that inequality gap in the first place of being able to have enough cash to be able to get a mortgage in the first place.
Bim?
I think looking at all these things is very reasonable, and I think that's exactly what we should be doing as well. As I say, I've talked about Help to Buy, and we should hugely increase that. I think that
But has Help to Buy been a success?
Well, it has.
Or has it inflated the housing market?
I can tell you in my own constituency, I've met people who they say we would not be able to afford this home without Help to Buy. What I think is we should extend it to more people and increase the amount that people can get on that Help to Buy scheme. But it's not the only thing. And I think that after the financial crisis, what happened was banks and how mortgages were assessed really disadvantaged a lot of younger people who could afford to pay their mortgages. I think we need to look again at that and to say, how is it that we can almost stack the deck more in favour of young people in the housing market?
That's what we're proposing.
Right, well, let's have a look at this headline. The Spectator: reviving Help to Buy would be disastrous for the housing crisis. But the very notion in that particular article that it just does act as an inflationary mechanism and actually makes it more affordable. If interest rates go up, which they have done, then people who have got on that housing ladder can't afford those mortgage payments.
It does, and the government have absolutely failed on housing. And I am actually quite glad that Keir Starmer has sort of recognised that this is a huge political issue. I'm glad that housing is now a high priority on the political agenda. Look, I mean, it's economics 101. If we increase the supply of anything, it will decrease prices. It is a supply issue. We are not building enough homes, and unfortunately, that's a result of both NIMBYs, but also government regulation and red tape.
Right. What do you think?
I think it's. I mean, one, I don't think either party in their recent periods of government can claim to be the party of home ownership. Home ownership among young people has fallen disastrously under the Conservatives. If you go back 20 or 30 years, actually, something like 2/3 of people aged 25 to 34 on an average wage owned a home. That figure's now fallen to 27%, so it's about a quarter from 2/3 just 25 years ago. So you're not the party of home ownership.
But as you say, successive governments even before that.
Absolutely, and the last Labour government didn't do enough on housing at all. But what we do need is a number of things. We need to increase the supply, yes, we do, which house building targets are a good thing.
Right.
I think the ban on overseas buyers is important. I don't think homes should be treated as investment opportunities. I think they're homes for families, and that's what they should be there for. You can invest in all kinds of other things, but not in housing. That should be for individuals. I personally would restrict it more for domestic buyers as well. I don't think, landlords are bad because they come from abroad. I think they're bad if they're over here. And I'm talking corporate landlords, big kind of companies that are buying up these housing estates and then renting them out to people at very high rates, which means they can't then save for a deposit, and then they can never buy. Or if they do, they have to get a 50-year mortgage by the time they've saved up in their 40s. It's just not sustainable, which is why
you would ban all overseas buyers?
Well, that's what Labour's proposal is, I believe, that was in the Observer, I think, this Sunday.
For new house builds.
Yeah, and
new
it's
house
called
builds. Yeah, for new
being
house
given
builds.
first dibs, as it was called in the piece.
Yeah, I think I would go further. There's no reason for an entity that isn't based in the UK to own a UK home.
Well,
frankly.
what do you think about that?
Absolutely wrong. I mean, just because they
Why?
are because only if you live in the United Kingdom or if you're British,
yes,
you can
if
buy
you're
a
resident
house.
in the UK, you need a UK home. If you're not resident in the UK, you don't need a UK home, do you?
Absolutely,
Why?
just not the problem. I mean, there's such a small portion of people that are.
Of course, that's not my major solution. I think it's a reasonable point, though.
Absolutely ridiculous proposal to ban foreign buyers.
Why is it ridiculous?
Because the solution is to increase the supply.
Why has a rich person based in America got more of a right to a home than a family in the UK?
It's about they have the money to be able to afford it.
But should they be at the top? Should they be at the top of the ladder then?
I think what Labour are proposing at the moment with this first dibs buy thing. I mean, I'm not necessarily as supportive of these targets, but actually I think I'd rather see the government have some kind of policy on increasing the supply. Really, that is the problem. Why are we banning other people from being able to buy homes in the country?
So look, I think we do need to increase supply, and one way in which we should do it.
So why did you drop the mandatory targets then for local authorities? Yeah, go on then.
One way in which we can do it is actually, in the right places, extending social housing. I think by having more social housing in the right places, not necessarily everywhere, what you do is you increase the total supply of homes. It's one thing the government can actually control.
But where are those right places? Just not in your backyard?
No, I didn't say that. I'd be quite happy
to have more social the problem is people will ask, if you drop those targets, well, for example, 55 local authorities have now dropped their housing targets as a result of the government deciding to abandon mandatory targets. And there you are, the houses won't be built.
So what I was saying is government should take a more active role in increasing supply, not just rely on a developer-led model where when you have mandatory housing targets, you often end up in the wrong homes built in the wrong places. What I'm saying is the government can shape this much more, often on government-owned land, and that will increase the total supply of homes. That will, in the end, allow more people to get on the ladder of home ownership, in addition to all the other measures that we talked about.
Right, I mean, having targets doesn't actually mean more homes, does it? I mean, how do you get local authorities to build them?
Well, in my local authority in Bristol, the Mayor of Bristol, Marvin Rees, set a target when he was first elected for house building in the city. And he's done a really good job in getting very close to that target.
Have prices gone down as a result?
Prices have gone up because of two reasons. One, because Bristol's a very popular place to live, and I would quite like to see things like rent controls in Bristol, something that we've been looking at the local authority.
And Marvin Rees.
OK, well, hang on. We'll come to...
Oh, well, let's come back to that in a second.
They're off your private renter.
But, of course, there is then a pool of housing that has to be available for rent as young people save up and earn the salaries to be able to buy a house. And the trouble with a lot of the protections for renters is that it exists, and that's a really important part of Keir's announcement today. It's not just about your ability to buy a home, it's about your ability to have secure private rental as you save up to be able to take advantage of that opportunity.
Well, before I get to respond on the rent controls, I mean, how do you persuade developers to start building? Developers that are land banking, waiting for prices to rise, which they have done for years. By saying you've got a target does not mean you can make them do it.
In Bristol, again, we've got a local authority-owned house building company called Gorham Homes that works in partnership with private developers to make the most of the sites that we have available. There are methods for doing this, and we've been showing in Bristol how that can be done.
What's your problem with rent controls?
Rent controls are effectively the best way to crush any city's house building targets. I mean, the fact of the matter is we saw this happen in Stockholm, for example, where rent controls were implemented. Of course, the supply of housing entirely decreased. Now the waiting lists to get onto the housing that are about 10, 20 years long. Rent controls are absolutely not the way forward. What we should be doing, as I've said before, is increasing the supply so that actually within those areas we're able to build. Take, for example, the Greenbelt. Why are we not able to build on the Greenbelt?
Well, but if you have rent controls and you build, then you are actually benefiting private renters and not constraining supply. I agree with you, there is that risk. If you did it now, just in this kind of free market mess that we're in on housing...
We're not in a free market mess.
We're in a totally free market mess.
We do not have a free market housing system.
We do. That's why people can't get in, because it's on money. Housing is a human right. It's an essential need. Everyone needs housing. The idea that it can just be auctioned off to the highest bidder, off-plan, and to overseas buyers and to everyone else, and to corporate landlords, who then jack up the prices for people to rent the homes that they could have bought if the banks actually looked at their rental history, because a lot of renters pay their rent every month and could afford a mortgage, which is often lower than the mortgage, but can't get a mortgage. That is absurd. But because so much of our housing, especially in cities like London, like Bristol, which is why Labour mayors in London and Bristol have both advocated rent controls, because that is part of the solution. It's not the totality of it, I agree with you, but it is part of the solution, because at the moment we have more and more share of people's income going on rent, and that's damaging for the entire economy, as well as bad for housing situation in this country.
Rent controls, wherever they're put in, they don't work. A city, not just Stockholm, take Berlin, where they impose rent controls. We've got huge problems with housing. In fact, the tech industry, which had Berlin as one of its key hubs, I think in Europe, if not the world, people are increasingly leaving Berlin because of the lack of
San Francisco's got rent controls, and that's right by Silicon Valley. They seem to be doing all right.
Hold on. You know what's been happening to house prices and rents in San Francisco? Going through the roof. It's one of the reasons why tech companies are leaving Silicon Valley.
Because the rent controls are very weak.
Because the rent controls mean that ultimately, over time, you actually reduce the availability of housing and the quality of the housing.
That's why you need a public sector builder.
And the quality of housing that's
not trying to make a profit.
But I was saying that, yes, the government can take a more active role in increasing the supply.
I agree with you on that.
I think we can do that, but the aim of increasing that is not to leave people in social housing. It's to enable them the money, time and availability to then get into the private sector where they can own their own home.
Right. Do you think this is going to be the issue at the next election?
Well, I hope it is, and I hope that both parties now look at this and actually decide that, young people, in order for them to sort of be won over by either party, housing has to be at the top of the political agenda.
Andrew, do you think it will be, or in the end, will people think about older voters who are homeowners, and think actually they're the ones that we need to protect?
I think that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is our electoral system favours the marginal seats, and unfortunately they're not in cities. In cities where the housing crisis is more acute, there tend to be safe seats, so you don't get policies that favour that.
On that note, that's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 11:15, of course, for Prime Minister's Questions. Bye-bye.